And James is going to take us to the first project.
Yep.
James.
Great, thank you. Hello. Oh, okay, cool. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. First off, I would like to thank my thesis chair, Lindsay May, as well as our thesis coordinator, Carl McQueen, for helping me through the design process this semester. I would also like to thank my friends and family and co-people in thesis for keeping me emotionally sane this semester. With that, I would like to begin talking about this thesis. A little bit of background on how this kind of came about. I did a study abroad in Scandinavia in the summer of 2018. And as part of that, we visited a lot of cemetery chapels and cemeteries. That's where some of the architecture is. And it was really interesting to get into the culture and understand that more emphasis is put on the design of these over there. And it got me into thinking about it a lot more. And thinking about how we can make these spaces in the US much better as well. So Death in the Round explores the concept of a cemetery complex on the urban edge that brings burial back into the public eye or the public realm, promoting sustainable ideals and creating a cemetery typology, a new sustainable cemetery typology in America. Today I would like to talk about a recent history of US burial tradition, as well as how the burial industry is affecting the environment, designing the mourner's experience, as well as placing a cemetery on the urban edge and design implementation of these factors. So to understand how cemeteries are today, we also need to understand how it led us up to this point. So before 1830, the US had a lot of churchyard burials. This is where the cemetery was in the city, and the church was kind of the center of everyday life for a lot of people, so we had a better relationship with death because it was present. We were always there, we were always around it. But the problem with churchyard burial is that these places got filled up very quickly, and we needed to do something about it because they're overcrowding. We didn't know we were going to bury people. So that's how the rural cemetery movement started. We moved outside of the city. We created these these picturesque landscapes. Romantic, that was the word I was looking for. That people actually wanted to be in. People were dead, buried here, but people also wanted to picnic here and spend some of their recreational time here. But the problem with this is we were still, again, expanding. We still needed more space. So what did we do? We kind of kept moving with this trend. We kept looking for more space. With the advent of the motorized lawnmower, we actually got rid of headstones so that we could mow the grass more efficiently and more quickly and more cheaply. And so the memorial garden has been kind of the most recent trend and has continued to today. Along with all of this, from 1888 to the present, we also have cremation in the US. Originally, cremation was a 36-hour process from heating up the kiln to the actual cremation to the cooling down of the remains. Today, that's been sped up to only a matter of a few hours. But we're still, so we're like taking up less space, which is great. We sped up the process, awesome, but we're still building buildings just to house these remains as well. So to some of these problems, we have overcrowding, we've distance from the population, which is contributed to stigma with death, a constant need for more space, as well as sacrificing variety for efficiency. So now we've talked about the current state, but we're also going to talk about how it's affecting the environment. In order to understand this, we need to understand the components of traditional burial. As many of you are familiar with, we have the headstone, but below ground, 6 feet under, we have a concrete burial vault, often including reinforcing, a steel liner that seals, again, the casket in, and then the casket is often pretty well sealed as well. So we're really creating these tight sealed packages for our loved ones that will be there forever. And with that, those materials obviously have an impact. Across the US every year, we use 30 million board feet of hardwoods. Embalming fluid, 800,000 gallons are put into the ground, as well as 1.6 million tons of reinforced concrete and 90,000 tons of steel. So those are our resources, but another material resource. But we also have traditional burial space. A 4-foot by 9-foot standard plot offers us about 800 graves per acre. And if we look at a city like Baltimore, for instance, that experiences about 6,200 deaths per year, that space starts to add up. After 20 years, we would use 0.24 square miles, which doesn't seem like a lot, but you start to lose parts of downtown and the inner harbor. After 100 years, 1.21 square miles, losing much more of the city. And if you think about the full life of a cemetery, after 300 years, a greater portion of the city is gone. And obviously we aren't putting one in the middle of the city. However, we need to find space for this because traditionally this is where we're going. But you might also be thinking, we've been cremating people a lot more now, right? We're not just burying them. So with that, we actually made a shift in 2015 from burial to more people actually being cremated. But the problem with this is that with each cremation comes 540 pounds of CO2. And if we use Baltimore again as an example with those 1,600 deaths annually, that's 3.3 million pounds of CO2 each year just from cremation. It's equivalent to 1,800 acres of US forest carbon sequestration each year, which again, if we look at Baltimore space, after 1 year, that's 2.8 square miles of need for additional forest. After 10 years, 28 square miles worth. And then after 33 years, all of Baltimore would have been forested to sequester that much carbon. But we can slow this down here, we can stop this. One of those methods, if we're still really pushing cremation, is alkaline hydrolysis. It uses heat and pressure to essentially reduce remains down to something similar to that of incinerated cremation that we're used to, but it uses a bit as a carbon. But, so we've kind of handled the cremation in a sense, but also, what if instead of using pesticides and fertilizers and motorized mowers to handle kind of creating these pristine lawns, what if instead we allowed natural flora to take over? What if we allowed the landscape to take hold more? What if instead of moving from one building to the next and driving across town to bury your loved ones, all this happened in one place. You go from the funeral hall, to the burial site. You take care to bury your loved one, and as you fill in their grave, part of that is also creating closure as it goes. And then from there, you're able to move on with the process, and a little bit of healing is instilled as well. And what if also we could be a little bit more sustainable with our material choices, using rapidly renewable resources rather than those that can't be renewed and will be in the ground forever. So that's natural burial. Compared to traditional burial, instead of a headstone, a stone might be left on site to mark a grave, or GIS data can actually be used to pinpoint where someone has been laid to rest. As well as an uncultivated landscape rather than this mowed lawn. This could just be that it's maintained less often, still creating this great space to be and a safe space to be, but using less chemicals, less pesticides. And then finally, the graves are more shallow, so we're using less resources to dig those graves as well. And then, obviously, as I said, using a lot less material comparatively to inter someone. So designing for the mourner's experience. Looking at some of the best examples of funeral architecture and burial spaces, some of the best examples are ones that provide multiple programmatic themes. For instance, funeral and cremation and repast, which is that meal that you would have and share with your loved ones to celebrate life after burial, as well as burial with planned recreation, kind of like the rural cemetery movement, as well as funeral and recreation as a necessity. These are ones where the cemetery doesn't quite have the funds to keep running, so they have to incorporate these other modes of recreation in order to keep the place running monetarily. So if we take those programmatic themes and apply them to these options, and then we can condense them to create this more holistic cemetery experience, one that includes a funeral ceremony or cremation, repast, that meal that we're having after we've interred our loved ones. Burial, and then also recreation, since the site's engaged in being used more often than those few times that someone's visiting their loved one. Additionally, when you think about sizing the ceremony, how are we going to accommodate for different funeral parties, for instance? And from different examples and precedents, we find that funeral halls typically end up being some groupings of somewhere in the 500 square feet, so a lot that are in the 1,500 square foot sizing, and then 4,500 square feet as well. And anytime that a building had multiple funeral halls within it, they ended up scaling a factor of 3 to 1, so that they're able to accommodate these different sizes, and so that each funeral ceremony can be intimate. Additionally, funeral parties are also people that are mourning. They're distressed, they have a lot on their minds, and they're already going through a lot. So as the plan can be more intuitive and more, it can make sense for people going through it, it's a lot less stress on them. So not having to figure out left or right, things like that. Also, the ceremony unit, so these elements that make up what should be in the funeral hall, such as services, a waiting area, courtyards, both interior and planted, as well as the ceremony hall itself. These aggregate to a form such as this. So we always talked about the elements that need to be in the cemetery, in the ceremony hall in this building. We talked about the programmatic elements. Where are we going to put this? We want something that is on the urban edge, as we've said. We want something accessible so that people are actually visiting it. We want an amenity so that people, again, want to be there. And so we started looking at, because people die everywhere, why not Baltimore?
That's a lot of
right. So looking at Baltimore, one main amenity we have is the waterfront, and that water is everywhere, right? So as we start to look closer, we want places that haven't been developed yet, that have the land that we need in order to build on. So moving in further, keeping that with the idea of the urban edge, we move into this area of South Baltimore and Fort Covington specifically. As you can see here, these areas are currently green space, and this area has been previously redeveloped, but is moving back to being green space as well. The idea here is that we can preserve the space between Interstate 95 and Hanover Street Bridge, this portion of the middle branch of the Patapsco River, and earmark those 100 acres for future burial. But specifically, we'd like to look at this site as the main site for this thesis. And this site is just, just on the western side of the Fort Covington area of land. Specifically, we want to look at this knuckle of space here for the main part of the building, as it has the greatest sense of place on site. And as I said, part of it is marked for future development, so it's going to sit on the edge of that and develop it for the cemetery. Moving through the site, to give you a bit of the context of the history, as you can see there on that southeast portion, this view shows that the site used to be a rail yard in the early 20th century. But the site today is a lot greener. It still has the views of the Hanover Street Bridge, as well as views across the river. There's also partially a large parking lot on site, and then this inlet here, which is part of that knuckle I mentioned before. And finally, moving all the way west on the site, there's the space between an old railroad bridge and 95. So earlier on the site, about the design implementation of that portion. At the greater site scale, we can look at some of the pathways that we need to accommodate the uses on site. For funeral circulation, if we are focusing on the building being in this area, we need veins of pathways in order to efficiently move to the other edges and get people to the burial sites and their plots specifically and efficiently. Also, recreational thoroughfares to get from the urban edge out to the waterfront to accommodate that space and allow people to understand that they are moving through a cemetery and understand that that burial's there and that's okay. Additionally, tertiary access, so there are more ways through site connector for sake of efficiency, a river walk trail that connects to this greater network and would encompass the greater cemetery site in the future. This is about a 3-mile walk or about an hour. Then we want to look at the landscape scale, understanding that the cemetery would take up the heart of these pathways and that recreation would happen on the waterfront or the water's edge. Looking a little something like this. And with that, we need to discuss different landscape typologies. Moving from the city toward the waterfront, we have woodlands, and then moving into the meadow typology, a different meadow typology, and then a waterfront park, as well as wetlands at the water's edge. At the building scale, we start with this large program that we have, and then dividing it into the sacred and profane, extending the sacred out to give it prominence. And then also this module is aligned with the city's, tangent to the city's street. We further define those programmatic areas into these separate units. We then swing out those programs to create space and rotate and align with the natural edge. All these separate units, or these separate objects, are then united under this greater canopy roof, creating this relationship of solid and void and plan. We apply the the ceremony unit that I mentioned previously, and accommodate the intuitive circulation for each of the different ceremony halls. Additionally, we have exterior circulation corridors, one for the user as well as one for the worker. And through views, so that they're to create a relationship from the water to the landscape beyond. Moving through the plans here, we have the mortuary in the center, followed by the crematorium. And then we have the different pools of these reflecting pools that enhance the cuts through the landscape through the building. And then followed by the service spaces I mentioned before, those waiting areas and ceremony units, the interior court, those planted courts that I mentioned, as well as the ceremony halls. From there, moving into the east wing, we have the office suites, as well as the refectory, these dining areas for the repast that I mentioned, that meal. And then we have warming kitchens in order to support the repast halls. Those warming kitchens are really for caterers to come in and have these like kind of ready to go space in order to finish preparing food and for serving rather than cooking on site. Services to support those, and then a bistro space, something to accommodate the needs of the public that might come to visit this cemetery. And finally, we also have porches, these different covered spaces, one to support the entry, one for an exterior event space, and then one for to accommodate outdoor seating for the bistro. Giving us a relationship of exterior to interior that looks a little something like this. So now we've talked about design of the building, we also want to talk about how we're going to use it and who's going to be using it. We have the mortician, someone's going to be handling the processing of remains. They're mostly in the crematory and the mortuary, oftentimes bringing remains to ceremony halls as needed. The funeral director is very busy. They and their assistants are moving from the offices to the ceremony halls, back to the repast to make sure that everything is, the repast halls to make sure that everything's moving along smoothly. We also have the neighborhood family. They've come from nearby, they're visiting their loved ones' gravesite. They go to visit the bistro for a bite to eat, and then they move out to the landscape in order to participate in programming provided by the cemetery. We also have the pre-need resident. This is someone that's looking to make their arrangements for when they pass away. They can pay for their funeral and also plan it, to a T. So they visit with the offices, understanding what they want. They would move to the ceremony units to see what they think would best accommodate them. the repast hall, and then finally going out to the site to figure out the best plot for themselves. We also have the nearby office worker who might just quickly grab a lunch, for instance, on site. Maybe they would walk around the waterfront before returning to work on like a lunch break, for instance. Finally, we have the morning family, which I want to talk about through the use of renderings. As they arrived to the site, they're met with a view similar to this. They move to the entry portico. As they're here, the ceremony unit for them becomes visible, these entry doors here. As they make their way to the ceremony hall, they pass through these cut-throughs that I've been mentioning that have the relationship between the landscape and the waterfront. We then get to this waiting area, or this receiving area, that people are kind of the staging space before going into the ceremony. You often greet your loved ones here before moving into the ceremony as a family or as a whole. In the ceremony hall, as you can see here, a service is held, or a celebration of life, whatever the deceased has desired or the family has desired. Before moving past the exterior event space, out to the landscape, to bury their loved one, and to create closure. And as they're burying their loved ones, often a sense of closure happens in this process. So as they're doing this, they might decide, after they've finished, that they want to take the more public route back to the repast hall, across that through-site connector bridge that I mentioned before, to have one final meal celebrating the life of their loved one, before ending their day and going home, or spending the rest of the day at the waterfront. With that, I'd like to open up for any questions you all have. Thank you.
Could you just walk us through the drawings here? So that
Of course. Just relating the photos, or?
maybe
Oh, sure.
speak to specific perspectives where
Definitely.
advertising.
Definitely. So for that session, commencement would be right about here, looking obviously at the building. The entry portico is here, looking this way again, a closer view. The grand ceremony hall will be this large one here. The woodland edge and waterfront would be, feel a little Vanna White right now, over here. And then, let's see, west of Woodlands is here as well. The East Meadow section here. The waterfront park was there as well, down here. And then, sorry. So the inlet walkway is here. You can see it there as well. The waiting room in here, and the through site connection, the connection to the riverfront is here as well.
So the walk along the water, that's the public one, and the one in the back with the more solid wall is all service?
Yes, except for at the end of so this is the more of the private,
Yeah.
the service space, and then as ceremony lets out, they would exit through this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Two immediate questions I have is, how did you come to decide to put the mortuary or the mortuary and kind of the cremation component at the main entrance?
Sure.
And then my second question is, do you envision there would be multiple funerals happening at the same time, and how does that work with, kind of the privacy of family and friends grieving together?
Sure. That's a great question. Those both are things I grappled with a lot. I think part of the placement of this is that I felt that it was important not to completely seclude that, the cremation and the mortuary. I think materiality allows it to be closed off and not open. But at the same time, because we're not incinerating, we don't need the infrastructure that kind of implies that what's really happening in that space. So I allowed it to be in the front because also as I said, I wanted to put it on display. And a lot of the workers, too, are in the space, too, for the most greater part of their day. In terms of the ceremony halls being used at the same time, often from my interviews with funeral directors, even ones with multiple halls, they aren't dealing with many that happen at the same time. The greatest reason for having multiple is so that you can accommodate the difference, and also, for instance, if a ceremony is happening here, someone could still be staging to the next one without this visual connection. That's why there's not a lot of porosity along these edges or along that side. A lot of the light that comes in is from the separation between these different volumes and from the clear story above on the ceremony halls. Excuse me.
So, not to be too grim, but do you envision this alternative to the more traditional cremation process would take place in that first building?
Yes.
And you have enough space to handle?
Yes, everything is self-contained, similar to regular cremation. The thing they need is potentially a water line in. As I mentioned, it's an aquaculture process, so it's water and lime that's heated and pressurized. But it's a self-contained unit. It's also about 4 feet by 10 feet. And it just needs clearance for it tilts up depending on the system. Yeah. So it needs just about the width around the entire unit.
You know, life is funny sometimes. 12 years ago, in this very space, I was a thesis student at Maryland, and I presented a urban cemetery.
Really?
Very similar to this. And, you know, Peter Newton was my thesis advisor. Every 5 to 10 years, there's a thesis student at Maryland who's very interested in death and wants to do an urban cemetery. So I appreciate the historical continuity of professors and individuals that students have explored this idea, and I love this project. I'm really happy to be here. It's just a matter of luck. A couple of things. I think the idea of an urban cemetery has always been interesting in history. If you look at, for example, the ancient Romans, they had an necropolis, a city of the dead, that you would go through before entering the city of the living. There was a very strong relationship between the death and the dead and the living. And you know, as you moved into the Romantic era, I think you showed photos of Oak Hill Cemetery in DC, maybe I recognize those. You know, in the 1800s, it became a kind of a romantic park and kind of a different relationship between the living and the dead.
Yes.
And I'm really encouraged to kind of renew this idea of kind of the urban dead and how they relate to the urban living. Another idea you may want to consider is, and you touched on this, is like the journey of the people, the mourners and the families. I think there's a sensitivity to, and in the 12 years since my thesis, I've gone to several funerals of loved ones and kind of really focused and contemplated on the nature of that. And I think the journey of going from everyday life to a kind of an out-of-body experience or kind of a contemplative mode of thought is really important to this program. And so I think if I had to give one tweak to this design, is maybe lengthening the time we're coming into the entry procession. You have the back of house and the supportive spaces, but then maybe the pavilions are a little farther in the landscape, and you really kind of, you have this time to kind of breathe mentally through the landscape and think about the loved ones, your family, your relationship, your mortality, essentially. And maybe these three pavilions, and I also think stacking the three pavilions together densely may be inconvenient for several families. It kind of throws you off of that mentality and that spiritual state that you're trying to achieve. So maybe refractor this building and put the pavilions out into the landscape. Maybe they have a relationship with the water. Maybe the dead are overlooking the living in the harbor. There are a lot of interesting sub-relationships between, and these trickle into architectural details as well. So, amazing project, and I really appreciate you looking into these issues that are very important.
Thank you.
It's a very good explanation at the beginning, very interesting. This song, I see. And very clearly delineated. Um, My first observation is there's a lot of circulation in your plan, in the
Yes.
curved segment. And is that because for some reason, you want people to enter each sanctuary room from the back and then exit out the
Yes.
front?
Yes, so that circulation plan I showed earlier, the idea is that you would slip in this way and then out the other. Because there's a certain transformation that will happen as part of the ceremony, like this part of the ceremony has taken place within the chapel. So there's a different state of mind that happens as if people were to see others that are about to go into the funeral, for instance, there's a slightly different state of mind. So the idea is that, yeah, you would slip in from this more public side to the more secluded private side. The reason for the extra space is so that people aren't cramped, and we've talked a lot about these chance encounters with people that maybe aren't part of your funeral party. They're not there to celebrate the life of the loved one that you're there for. So the thought is that having this extra space keeps those chance encounters from being quite so intense and having some extra
So
looser space.
it's very directional. Your floor plan is
Yes.
very directional, suggesting where people should go. But when I look at the site plan, over there,
Yes.
and I'm looking at this whole breadth of the woodland, the whole thing, and people will be buried eventually.
Yes.
Across the whole thing, and yet the curved piece seems to be sending people off in one direction. And so I begin to question that.
Okay.
And wondering if the curved piece doesn't, rotate 45 degrees, and so that you could enter and exit at either end. And that maybe you only need one courtyard, and so the service piece is a bar where you have it, but the curved piece is behind it with one courtyard between the two. Would simplify, and then your directional movement of people would be naturally to go from the ceremony to where the jar or whatever is being buried. I'm not quite sure what that would be. It seems like trying to direct people's movement is always dicey in architecture.
Yes.
And I'm not sure it's really necessary here,
Okay.
that people are used to entering from the rear of a sacred space and going back out. And in fact, in the old days when there was a casket, you would follow the casket back out the same door and then go to wherever. And so if the services are not scheduled all at the same time, I'm wondering if, that could have just loosened up a lot.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. That's a fair comment. To respond to that, again, the entry and the exit, the thought is that as if there's a different state of mind, but also the idea that there's a sense of continuity after someone passes away. There's some, maybe if the matriarch passes away, another one rises to power in the family, or for instance, some other life is born and someone passes away. So this idea of continuity and setting this as part of the greater circle, the greater edge, I thought was kind of important. And rather than retreating back out the same way that you came in.
So talk about this roof.
Yes. Just talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Structurally, material-wise, or
Just
why?
why it's there.
Okay. So the idea behind including this roof was to unify these separate building volumes underneath. The thought too is to kind of create this canopy, this pavilion. So once you're under it, though you're not in your specific unit yet, there's a sense of place and you're there, if that makes sense.
So the two sides, the curved part and the rectilinear part, they're all under the same roof, and there's this skylit slot between them. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So just to add on to some of the things that were said earlier, I think that this project, which I think is very interesting, and I think the research is great, and by the way, a lot of these individual spaces that you show in these drawings are really pretty fabulous.
Thank you.
So we get to, it's very clever, very well done. So then we get to some of the details, and then we have to sort of pick on you a little bit.
That's fine.
So I think that what your project really wants to be is two buildings, not one.
Okay.
One is the gate building, the gatehouse building, which is all of this, I mean, to here.
Yes.
And then I think that the pavilions that Nandor is talking about want to be detached from that. I think that because if you look at this site plan, you know, this woodland or this park that you're talking about could actually be all of this. I would try to move this as close to the road as you possibly could, and then I make this all park and make the barrier pavilions in the park.
I see.
And then I would make this building really much simpler.
Okay.
I think that huge roof isn't doing anything for it. It's very expensive, it's a lot of air, I don't know why it's there. I think this could be almost nothing.
Maybe it's sharing a sense of importance.
Right, well, that's the thing, the hierarchy is not right.
Okay.
So when you look at this, I look at that drawing and think, I wish that roof wasn't there at all, actually. I don't think that it's helping you.
Okay.
So, and then what Amy's talking about is at the level of plan, there's too much equivalence between the two
I
sides.
see.
You know, this side is actually partly buried, this part is open to the water.
Yes.
So why are they the same? And I'm not sure, I'm really unconvinced of that in this building, where one's service and one's not. It doesn't feel that way. It really feels like this program wants to be hard up against that wall. There's some kind of more interior circulation. Or it, you know, the thing about service circulation is people know how to do it, right? People work there, they know how to do it.
Yeah.
So it can be hidden. Public circulation can't be hidden because people get lost.
Yes.
So you need to think about the hierarchy of those things. So again, I think you have this gate building, which is a kind of a veil with, you know, back to reality or, you know, secular life, and you pass through that into the garden, and then you do the barrels.
It's a really good point.
Sorry. Who am I?
I think I'm going to agree with everything that's been said. I think the separation of the kind of hard edge, and then I would say three different pavilions, different sizes, different shapes in the landscape. And the nice thing about that is you're not, you're kind of positioned perhaps closer to where your ceremonial, you know, where you leave the remains is going to happen. So I think those are all good suggestions. And your presentation and the perspectives are really nice. One other thing is parking. I think parking is a reality that a lot of people are going to have to park to get here. I assume this big white area is parking. So here. This.
Yes. These are service parking. So this is if we're dropping, if employees were to come and park for the morning, as well as if remains are being dropped off for processing. And then for this side, is for a catering van is coming in to unload goods that are going to be ready and prepared to serve.
So sense of arrival then, I guess I thought this sort of back service parking was your main parking, which got me very concerned because then you're coming into the back of, and I've been to funerals before where you end up, because of where you park, you come in the back door, and it feels very, you're going into what's supposed to be a somewhat secular religious experience, and you're going in the back door. I think the scale of these tall columns and the roof, I agree with Ralph about the overall roof covering the entire thing is, it takes away some of the intimacy of the experience. But the scale seems really good too.
I think you should talk about these materials that put up here.
Well, before we get to that, Carl, sorry, I'm going to forget to that. But I think that would be interesting. But I think, a larger part that I wanted to comment on, and having, attended many, I think I had attended 4 funerals from August to September, so it's pretty fresh in my mind. But I think a lot of it, I was glad to see the dining area, the place overpass, but I think also there's a lot of gathering, it's a time to meet with family, and you're doing that before a service, you know, as you're starting to gather. So I think almost a free space before you go into the area, because I think a lot of people want to congregate outside of that main space where the service is being held, because it feels, you know, it is a separate process. You're meeting and greeting family, which you're happy to see. It's under not so great circumstances, but it is a time where you're catching up and you want to have those secular conversations,
Yes.
those conversations of reunion prior to, you know, the respect and, you know, more tearful interactions with immediate family and some other, you know. So I think a little free space would be good. You know, I do like the idea of a bar that you pass through, that is that threshold. I don't know that this is an immediate or great precedent, but I think a lot of Longwood Gardens, where if you know that it's almost, the building is almost just a, I keep using the term berm, but I mean, it's very understated. You just move through and out into the garden. And then there are, you know, the correlation here would be, and then you discover these other pavilions within the landscape. So I think, you know, something like that experience, you definitely feel, and it's that compression expansion, you know, it's that sense of, you know, you're moving through this zone of transition, but it isn't the main event. I think that would have helped clarify some of the comments and address some of the comments that you've heard. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of thoughtful moments. I think there will, I mean, I guess this is, if you choose to go through the hydration, I don't know what an alkaline hydrolysis process, only, you know, I know like different people have different choices about that. So I assume this is, you've already made that choice.
So the thought, so that's a really great point. In my interviews with some of the directors that run some of the natural burial cemeteries, I tried to ask about the clientele, essentially, like who's doing this. A lot of them said it's just the people that want this, or the people that are really into, they said the hippies of the 70s and 80s, they're getting ready to plan their funerals. And they want to make like this, not like this impact that they don't want to make an impact on the environment when they go. So the thought is the people that want to be buried here, the people that have bought into this idea and ready.
That's fine.
So whether that's natural burial or alkaline hydrolysis.
I think that's a good answer to that question. Just two other things, if I may. The parking, I feel like, you know, there is a sequence. A lot of people who are visiting, you know, might have mobility issues, maybe, you know, it's definitely higher percentage of aging people, so they, you know, the drop-off sequence at the building is very important. I wish there was something other than just a parking lot across the street to accommodate the parking. And it's your thesis, you could park them under the building or something else. And I feel like it's kind of a shame to have that directly across from your main entrance and threshold. I feel like that's kind of detracting from the experience of it. Maybe going underground isn't the right metaphor for those people, but I just wish it was addressed in some other way. I don't know what that way is. And then the last point would be the accessibility of the pathways.
Sure.
Because I see a lot of what I think I see is the kind of grass pathways or, you know, kind of plots in the woods. And again, I think of, you know, a lot of the gatherings that I've been to recently, getting to the burial site. There's a lot of people with mobility issues and you're trying to get there, and it's, you know, that has to be accommodated. I understand.
Yeah, that was one thing I had a lot of issues with, because I worked in a disability office for 2 years in undergrad, so it is on my mind often. Part of what I was grappling with was the requirements of natural burial and trying to maintain, and I probably could have looked more into it, but trying to maintain the idea of the porosity of those pathways. So making it to that final step is something I think that I agree and could be resolved right now.
James?
So I support what has been said before. Just briefly, my feeling is that you've created this sort of temple-like building. I see it in the plan, and the idea of consolidating all that, I agree with with that. To me, this could be something that grows out of landscape. You've had this, big swath, and, we've seen these kind of buildings, I guess, maybe Korea and Japan, this building type. And from what I recall, you do tend to be you end up in a landscape, but you are sort of below, or you're in folds. And I think of Vietnam veterans where it's a fold.
Sure.
And the landscape comes over the top. It's not a building. It's all part of the form. And that could be a really poetic composition that you could do here. And you don't want to feel like you're in some damp, murky underworld or underground. But it can be done nicely in that regard. So
Can I just tag on to that, because my question is similar, because I'm
Sure.
sure you've thought about it. Another way is just to ask this relationship between the monumentality of the structure
Yes.
and the character of the landscape. And you ended up with a real contrast. So I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about how you got there and why you ended up here, because I think that builds on Bill's question, and that really strikes me when I look at the burial.
Sure.
And Don wants to tag on also.
Okay. So the thought behind the monumentality and the kind of the greatness and the loftiness of this overarching structure is to kind of, in a sense, bring people down a bit in a way. We often think very highly of ourselves, and in a sense, we also think highly of ourselves in the sense of preserving our bodies in nature, or excuse me, by the way that we're packaging ourselves in traditional burial with the casket and everything in the essentially airtight casket, about 6 feet under. So the thought here is to kind of give understanding like we're not as big as we think we are in a sense, and also to, as I said before, to unite those different units. The relationship of it to the landscape was also to kind of call attention to itself and to put it on some kind of footing with the future development in terms of the scale and accommodate the needs of the program. In terms of trying to meld these two together, part of what I wanted to mention too is that in that entry perspective, we see the earth kind of moving up, blocking part of the lower area of the building. And on the sides here, those cut-throughs, those through views I mentioned before, those are landform raised walls that you look through as well. So there's a sense of going underground included in that walk through the private corridor.
So, really great program. I'm very interested in this. As somebody who's probably the only person here who's excavated an entire cemetery, I'm maybe more interested not in the buildings but in the ground. So I have a couple of questions about that. So, are you proposing burying both cremains and full body burial?
Yes.
In this space?
Yes.
Okay. So then my next question is, where is sea level in 2050 in this setting?
That's a great question. I was waiting for someone to bring it up. So in 2050, no, it's okay.
I think
there's a few things. So in 2050, for instance, in 100 years, all of the graves are still above the projected sea level rise, 1. 2, by the time that happens, because people are decomposing, we are burying more people over time. However, by the time that happens, so few will be in that process that it won't matter. They're back to the earth. We've been reintroduced back into the land. And 2, if that's the case, So 2, if that's the case, very few remains are still there. And if it comes that everything is underwater at a certain point, that's okay too. The graves aren't marked. And part of this is an idea of a digital memorial to mention it.
Great. I do really like your your homage to the railroad roundhouse. I'm guessing that's what that curved building with the track-like paths coming into it? No? That just happened.
I was thinking.
It's great,
Yes.
it's great, it's great,
It's
yeah. And then, so finally, Jessica Mitford, in her book, The American Way of Death, argues that, that the modern cemetery movement, right, the modern funeral business is really both a commodification of death and kind of a move from the reality of death to take us to away from that and to kind of separate us from that. So how do you see your project, sort of think of her argument and her speculation on the way Americans now view death? How do you see this fitting into that?
Into that view of how we
theoretical
view death?
Yeah.
I see it as, based on this project, the idea is that we be interacting with death as part of our everyday life, that it's adjacent to us and it's a part of us and it's okay to live with it, and we shouldn't be closing it up behind fences and sealing it away in tight boxes, but rather letting it become a part of who we are and what we do. And then we can have a different relationship with those who have passed, rather than trying to create or trying to continue that full relationship and holding on to that connection.
I think, even though I do like your thesis a lot, your building is very interesting, and I find your exploration of the separation of the sacred spaces and the more mundane spaces, service spaces, separate. Kind of like what you would do with a restaurant or something like that. That there is a separation of service, separation of vertical. I find all that interesting. My question has to do with the site and the choice of the site. And my question has to do with your premise that you started with the number of deaths across time. You're going to run out of land very quickly. And I don't see the idea, or I don't see how you are actually dealing with this growth.
Sure.
Secondly, I'm making more commentaries and questions. Secondly, there is a thing about going to a grave and visiting someone that has passed away. For some people, that doesn't matter. For some people, it's okay to be in ashes and spread some of that. But for others, it does matter.
Yes.
To the point where that's actually property that you buy and you actually have a piece of paper saying,
yes,
own that piece of land.
Exactly.
There's a reason why they are mowed. They're not just mowed because of convenience. They're mowed because of a sense of respect, a sense of permanence. There's nothing more permanent than death. So I find the idea of growing trees, which you can't cut roots because you killed the tree, or then you're going to plant a tree on top of a body, which then you cannot visit anymore. So this is a very interesting approach to how you actually deal with death. And the sense of death in many cultures, throughout the world, there's ways of dealing with that. Some people live with death every day. They have cults around it. Other religions have a day a year that you go and put some flowers or something. And so that part, I don't know how you were dealing with.
I understand. So in terms of, I'm going to respond to the space really quickly. In terms of the space issue, the idea of the actual burial, and this happens in other countries as well, they recycle grave space every 20 years. Norway is known for that especially. So the thought here is that as people, as the body decomposes, after about 20 years, the same is true for the bones. So there's no need for collecting those. We can rebury over the space over time. In 300 years, if we reserve your tombstone, it's there forever. We can't put someone new there. And so in 500 years it's there, in 1,000 years it's there. Someone's fixing it, someone's mowing it, someone's growing plants near it. It's hanging out there, but no one's visiting it, right? And your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the same thing will continue. So it's
Cremated remains, are they in a vessel or are they just in a paper bag put into the ground so that they're eventually?
They can be,
I mean,
you could put them in a paper,
Stable.
yeah, you could put them in a paper bag, but I won't stop you. But so you could use wick or you could use softwoods.
Something that will.
Yeah, it can still be something formal. It just doesn't have to be.
That's kind of a missing piece of your presentation, as, because I think that was a very good point about the trees. And I know I'm not speaking into the mic part, but you've drawn all the biomass of the trees here.
Yes.
But there's again that amount of biomass of those trees underneath. And then very sporadically, I think those are coffins, regular coffins.
Yeah.
Right. I'd like to see a plan of all the sites, just like you showed us at the beginning.
With
Oh, way down there?
Oh, that's
How the
the
grade,
process
how
of
they actually
every
grade.
single grave.
Yeah, how are you going to calculate to get the most out of this and make it dense? And how are you going to bury people without, because as we said, you can't cut down 3 feet.
Exactly.
But they've
With the
been
trees.
doing that for 80 years at Woodland Cemetery, the last one design.
Yeah, it's maybe the density of the trees could be argued, but the
Is it
tree.
the type of tree that has a taproot instead of spreading?
Those are all, that's a pine forest.
Yeah.
Oh, pine forest,
Pine
yeah,
forest.
which is not this kind of deciduous thing.
There are parts of it that, yeah, there are parts, the
So-
back end is more of the pine. This is more deciduous.
It would have been very interesting to really get into that.
Yeah.
To really draw all
And they are,
all of them.
yes, so that's a really good point. I wish I had gotten into that detail. But I will say that they have been burying, using natural burial in forests across the US since 1995. The first one had opened. So they've been doing this for a long time. There's actually the Green Burial Council, if anyone feels like going online. Sounds a lot like the Green Building Council, but they've been regulating this since 2005. If you want to learn more about the science.
Landscape architecture profession is aware of that, because they don't want you to ever come into it.
So I think in general, this conversation has been, between us, very fruitful the whole semester, and then between all of us today, very fruitful in questioning and making us imagine a more sophisticated approach to how we treat death, how we treat land, how we treat parts of the city. And I think the research that went into this site is what is really anchoring or grounding or rooting us in the conversation. And I commend sort of your maturity to take on a topic like this, to take it seriously. You know, in the beginning we had a lot of really squishy, squeamish conversations about remains and bones and materials, and I think that you're able to lead a room full of people in a very mature, serious conversation, and then we can talk about the design and the cultural implications beyond that. I think is a testament to the thesis and to your commitment to changing the way we think about things that we take for granted around us. So congratulations. Thanks, James. I think Brian
No, I don't want, I thought Peter was the chair. You're the chair, you get the final word, that's it. I'll find it.
Congratulations.